What makes a man unforgettable? Is it his brilliance, his wealth, his inventions? Or is it the scars he carries, the mistakes he made, the storms he survived, and the way he kept coming back when the world counted him out? Steve Jobs wasn't just a man who built a company, a dropout who shook universities, a barefoot dreamer who challenged corporations, a failure who returned from exile to reshape history, and in the end, a visionary who stared death in the face but left behind a legacy so massive it still beats inside the pockets of billions of people today. But behind this legend lies a story very few truly know. A story of rejection, betrayal, failures, untold sacrifices, and near collapse. A story that proves one truth: greatness is never given. It is forged in fire. So sit back, because what you're about to hear is not just the story of Steve Jobs. It is the story of obsession, rebellion, heartbreak, downfall, resurrection, and immortality. The beginning, a child unwanted, yet destined. On February 24, 1955, in San Francisco, a baby boy was born. His biological parents, Joanne Schiebel and Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian political science graduate student, were young, unmarried, and not ready to raise a child. Out of fear and pressure, they placed him for adoption. This child, abandoned before he even took his first steps, was named Stephen Paul Jobs. He was taken in by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple. Paul was a mechanic who never graduated high school, but he had hands that could fix anything. Clara was a bookkeeper, warm and supportive. They weren't rich, they weren't highly educated, but they gave Steve the one thing that mattered most: belief. Paul Jobs once told young Steve, "You've been chosen. Your biological parents gave you up not because they didn't love you, but because they wanted you to have the best chance in life." Steve carried this with him forever, the idea that he wasn't abandoned, but chosen. And from that seed grew both his insecurity and his obsession with proving himself to the world. The outsider at school. Steve was not like other kids. From the start, he was restless, sharp, and deeply curious. Teachers described him as a handful. He was brilliant, but he didn't like authority. In the 3rd grade, he once got so bored that he filled an entire classroom with pranks, setting off explosives, swapping signs, and even releasing snakes. But Steve's intelligence was undeniable. He was pushed ahead in school, skipping a grade. Yet this left him isolated, smaller, and lonelier than his classmates. He was bullied often. He would retreat into electronics, tinkering in the family garage with his father, taking apart radios and televisions, learning not just how things worked, but how they were built. This garage would later become the birthplace of Apple. A teenage rebel meets destiny. By high school, Steve Jobs was anything but ordinary. But destiny had another gift waiting for him. At Homestead High, he met a fellow student who shared his obsession with electronics, a shy, brilliant engineer named Steve Wozniak. Wozniak, or Woz, was a wizard at building things. Jobs, on the other hand, had vision. Woz could design circuits. Jobs could see products. Together, they made a dangerous combination. Their first joint venture, a prank device called the Blue Box. It allowed people to make free long-distance phone calls by mimicking the tones used by AT&T's telephone systems. It was illegal, but the two Steves sold them around campus. Jobs later said, "If it wasn't for the blue boxes, there wouldn't have been Apple. That was the start of us believing we could do anything," dropping out to tune in. After high school, Jobs went to Reed College in Oregon. But almost immediately he felt trapped. He didn't want lectures, he wanted freedom. He didn't want assignments, he wanted exploration. Within months he dropped out. But instead of going home, Jobs stayed around Reed, sleeping on floors of friends' rooms, returning Coke bottles for food money, and attending classes he actually cared about, like calligraphy. This seemingly random decision would later define Apple's soul. As Jobs once said, "If I had never dropped in on that calligraphy class, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts." He was connecting dots that no one else could see. Not yet. A spiritual quest to India restless, Jobs went to India in 1974 with a friend. He shaved his head, wore robes, and wandered across villages, searching for enlightenment. He lived on little food, fell sick often, and realized spiritual wisdom wasn't found in temples but in simplicity. Zen Buddhism became a foundation of his life. It taught him focus, clarity, and minimalism, all of which later shaped Apple's clean designs. Jobs came back to California, thinner, calmer, but still hungry, not for food, but for purpose. And soon, purpose came knocking. The birth of Apple. In 1976, Jobs and Wozniak built their first computer in the Jobs family garage. Woz designed it, Jobs packaged it and pitched it. They called it the Apple I. Jobs wasn't just selling a machine, he was selling a dream. While others saw computers as tools for scientists, Jobs saw them as personal companions for everyone. He convinced a local computer store, Byte Shop, to buy 50 units. Apple Computer was born, but Jobs wasn't satisfied with just selling circuit boards. He wanted beauty, simplicity, elegance. He wanted the computer to be an experience. This obsession led to the Apple II, a sleek, user-friendly computer that changed the game. By 1980, Apple went public. Jobs, the barefoot dropout, became a millionaire at 25. The boy who once sold illegal blue boxes was now one of the youngest people in history to control a Fortune 500 company. It seemed like the fairy tale was complete, but the real story was only beginning. The visionary and the tyrant inside Apple, Jobs was a storm. Brilliant but volatile, inspiring but terrifying. He demanded perfection, screamed at employees, pushed them past breaking points, and fired people without warning. He was called arrogant, ruthless, impossible. But he also inspired a small group of engineers to achieve the impossible. His obsession, a computer that was friendly, simple, and beautiful. This became the Macintosh. When it launched in 1984 with the famous 1984 Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott, the world gasped. The Mac was revolutionary. Graphical interface, mouse, fonts. It wasn't just a tool, it was art. But behind the applause, Apple was bleeding. The Mac was expensive, and sales didn't match the hype. Jobs clashed with the CEO he himself had hired, John Scully, former Pepsi executive. The boardroom became a battlefield. And then came the unthinkable. Steve Jobs, the founder, the visionary, was stripped of power and pushed out of his own company. Exiled and broken. Imagine this. You build a company from nothing, pour your soul into it, and at 30 years old, you're fired from it. That's what happened to Steve Jobs in 1985. For a man who lived to prove himself, it was humiliation at the highest level. He was crushed, depressed, and wandering. But deep inside, Jobs knew failure could either destroy him or forge him. He chose to fight. The next chapter. In exile, Jobs started another company, Next Computer. He wanted to build powerful machines for education and business. The technology was advanced, but the market wasn't ready. Next never became a hit commercially, but its software would later become the heart of Apple's rebirth. Meanwhile, Jobs made another move that would change the world in a way even he didn't fully realize. In 1986, he bought a small graphics company from George Lucas for $10 million. That company was Pixar. Pixar, the unlikely gamble. At first, Pixar was struggling. It sold expensive hardware that no one wanted. But Jobs kept funding it, keeping it alive when most people would have given up. Eventually, the team pivoted to animation. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first full-length computer animated film. It was a sensation. Pixar went public, and Steve Jobs became a billionaire, not from Apple, but from cartoons. It was proof that even in exile, Jobs could turn dust into diamonds. A call from the past. By the mid-1990s, Apple was in crisis. Its products were failing. Its leadership was weak, and the company was on the brink of collapse. Desperate, Apple made a decision that stunned the world. They bought Next in 1997, bringing back Steve Jobs, the man they once exiled. This was no ordinary return. This was a resurrection. Steve Jobs was back, and this time he wasn't just going to save Apple. He was going to reshape the world. The return of the exiled king. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was in ruins. It was hemorrhaging money, its products were confusing, and Wall Street expected bankruptcy. The world saw a sinking ship. Jobs saw a blank canvas. But he came back not as the wide-eyed dreamer of the 1980s. He came back leaner, sharper, wiser, tempered by exile and humbled by failure. In his first town hall meeting with Apple employees, Jobs delivered words that would become legendary. "We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. The era of competition is over. We need to focus on what we do best." And then, in a move that shocked the world, Jobs announced a partnership with Microsoft. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen, live via satellite, pledging $150 million in investment and committing to keep developing Microsoft Office for the Mac. The audience booed, but Jobs silenced them. "We have to embrace the future. We must think different." It was the first sign that the rebel had become a strategist. Simplify or die. One of Jobs' first acts was brutal. He slashed Apple's bloated product line. Instead of dozens of computers, he created a simple grid. Consumer versus professional, desktop versus portable. 4 products. That's it. From this philosophy came the iMac in 1998. It wasn't just another computer. It was translucent, colorful, and fun. It looked like something from the future. And most importantly, it was simple. The iMac was a hit, selling millions and restoring Apple's profitability. But Jobs wasn't satisfied. He didn't just want Apple to survive, he wanted it to dominate. The cult of perfection. Steve Jobs was infamous inside Apple. He obsessed over every detail, down to the shade of white on a box, the curve of a button, the font on a screen. He would demand prototypes be built and rebuilt dozens of times until they felt right in his hands. One engineer recalled Jobs yelling, "This is trash, you can do better." But in the same breath, Jobs would inspire them to push past limits they never thought possible. Employees lived in fear and awe. Some called it the reality distortion field. Jobs' ability to convince anyone that the impossible was possible. And more often than not, he was right. The digital hub strategy. By 2000, Jobs saw something others didn't. Computers were no longer the end product. They were the hub of a digital lifestyle. Cameras, music players, camcorders, and phones would all connect through the computer. This vision led to the iPod in 2001. At the time, MP3 players existed, but they were clunky, ugly, and limited. Jobs wanted something different. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Elegant, easy, cool. The iPod wasn't just a gadget, it was a cultural phenomenon. White earbuds became a status symbol. Teenagers, businessmen, celebrities, everyone wanted one. Apple was no longer just a tech company. It was becoming a fashion statement, a lifestyle. Shadows behind the stage. But even as Apple soared, Jobs' personal life carried shadows. In his early years, Jobs had fathered a daughter, Lisa Brennan, with his high school girlfriend, Chris Ann Brennan. At first, Jobs denied paternity, even swearing in court that he was sterile. It was a painful, cruel rejection that haunted Lisa for years. Later, Jobs acknowledged her and tried to build a relationship. But the wounds of abandonment, his own and the one he inflicted, ran deep. Lisa once described her father as complicated, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, always intense. For all his brilliance, Jobs struggled with intimacy and empathy in his personal life. The same man who could design products to touch billions often failed to connect with those closest to him. A dark discovery. In 2003, just as Apple was conquering the music world, Jobs received devastating news. He had a rare form of pancreatic cancer. True to his nature, Jobs refused conventional treatment at first. He believed in alternative diets, fruit cleanses, acupuncture. For 9 months, he delayed surgery. He thought he could outthink or outwill the disease, as he had done with every obstacle in life. But cancer was not a competitor that could be distorted by his reality field. By the time he agreed to surgery, precious time had been lost. This was the beginning of a long, painful battle that would shadow every triumph that followed. The iPhone revolution. Even as his health faltered, Jobs' ambition burned brighter than ever. He looked at cell phones, clumsy devices with plastic buttons and terrible software, and saw an opportunity. What if a phone could be not just a phone, but an iPod, a computer, a camera, a map, and more, wrapped into one elegant device? In 2007, on stage at Macworld, Jobs unveiled the iPhone. He called it an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. Are you getting it? These are not three separate devices. This is one device. The crowd erupted. The world changed. The iPhone was sleek, touch-driven, and powerful. It turned Apple into the most valuable company in the world and redefined how humans communicate, work, and live. But behind the glow of innovation, Jobs' health was deteriorating. The fragile genius. As Apple's empire grew, Jobs' body weakened. He grew thin, gaunt, often appearing fragile on stage, yet his charisma never dimmed. In 2009, he took a leave of absence for a liver transplant. In 2010, he returned to unveil the iPad, redefining yet another category of technology. But the clock was ticking. Jobs knew his time was limited, and with that urgency, he doubled down on what mattered most. Behind the curtain of Apple. Few people know the storm that raged inside Apple's walls. Jobs' leadership style was ruthless. Meetings often ended with tears. Engineers described working under him as both the most terrifying and the most rewarding experience of their lives. One employee recalled, "Working for Steve was like working in the presence of God. You hated him and loved him at the same time, but you never left unchanged." Jobs pushed his team to make products that were not just functional, but insanely great. And while he often broke people, he also forged legends. Many of Apple's most iconic designs, the iMac, iPod, iPhone, were born from this crucible of fire. A legacy written in code and glass by 2011, Apple was the most valuable company in the world. From the brink of bankruptcy to global domination in less than 15 years, it was the greatest comeback story in business history. But Jobs' body was failing. On August 24, 2011, he resigned as Apple's CEO, handing the reins to Tim Cook. In his letter, he wrote simply, "I have always said that if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." The world held its breath. Everyone knew the end was near. The final days. Steve Jobs spent his last month surrounded by family, his wife Lorene, his children Reed, Erin, Eve, and Lisa. Despite his frailty, he remained sharp, still discussing product ideas, still obsessing over design. He once told his biographer, Walter Isaacson, "I like to think that something survives after you die. It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience, and it just ends." On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The news shook the world. Millions mourned not just a man, but a force of nature, a rebel who bent reality, who shaped the future, who made technology feel human. Apple stores became memorials. Strangers left flowers, candles, iPods, and handwritten notes. Leaders across the globe, from Bill Gates to Barack Obama, paid tribute. Beyond death. But Steve Jobs' story didn't end with his death. His fingerprints remain on every iPhone, every MacBook, every piece of glass and aluminum that carries his vision. His philosophy of merging art with technology became the DNA of the modern world. He once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why even be here?" And dent it he did. Dent, the man behind the myth. Steve Jobs was many things: visionary, tyrant, genius, perfectionist. But to truly understand him, you must look beyond the headlines. He was not a saint, nor a villain. He was human, wrapped in contradictions. On one hand, Jobs could inspire with words that lit fires in the souls of his employees. On the other, he could humiliate them in front of peers for the smallest mistakes. He sought elegance in products, yet often created chaos in people's lives. He could be brutally cold, even to friends, even to family. And yet he could also be deeply vulnerable, searching for meaning, grappling with mortality, and clinging to the fragile beauty of life. Perhaps that's what made him unforgettable. His flaws made his brilliance human. His failures made his triumphs legendary. Stories few people know. There are stories hidden in the folds of Jobs' life that reveal the man behind the myth. Like the time he would park his Mercedes-Benz in handicapped spots at Apple headquarters, never with a license plate. because California law allowed cars without plates for the first 6 months after purchase. Jobs simply swapped cars every half year. Why? Some say it was arrogance, others say it was his hatred of rules. For the time he demanded that Apple's original Macintosh factory be painted in perfect shades of white, down to the bathroom walls. He spent weeks obsessing over tile choices, because to him, the environment shaped the product. Or when he ate only carrots and apples for weeks, convinced it would cleanse his body. His diet turned his skin orange. He later embraced veganism and fasting, believing food shaped clarity of thought. And then there were moments of tenderness, like when he cried uncontrollably after hearing Bob Dylan's lyrics about life and loss, or when he held his newborn son Reed and confessed, "It's amazing. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way." These stories, often overlooked, remind us that Steve Jobs was not just a legend. He was a fragile, eccentric, restless soul, trying to find balance between genius and humanity. The controversies. Steve Jobs' life was not without controversy. He was accused of stealing credit, especially in the early days. Many engineers behind the Macintosh felt their contributions were overshadowed by Jobs' fame. Some called him manipulative. Others accused him of treating workers as disposable in his pursuit of perfection. In 2006, Apple faced criticism over poor working conditions at its Chinese manufacturing partner, Foxconn. Long hours, low pay, and harsh environments raised questions about whether Apple's beautiful products were built on ugly practices. Jobs, often defensive, struggled with this criticism. He believed Apple pushed suppliers to improve, but the controversy remained, casting shadows on his legacy. And then there was his personal cruelty. Friends described how he could cut people out of his life without hesitation. Even in his final years, he could be distant, blunt, and hard to reach emotionally. But perhaps it was this edge, this refusal to compromise, that gave him the fire to build what others thought impossible. He lived in extremes, always pushing, never settling. Lessons from failure. Jobs himself admitted, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to me." Why? Because failure stripped him of ego. It forced him to rediscover creativity. Without Apple, he found Pixar. Without power, he found humility. Without certainty, he found resilience. When he returned to Apple, he carried those scars. They sharpened him, made him ruthless with time, and laser-focused on what mattered most. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of Jobs' life. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the forge of success. The Stanford Speech. In 2005, Jobs delivered one of the most famous commencement speeches of all time at Stanford University. His words were not corporate slogans, they were raw confessions. He spoke of dropping out of college, of connecting dots backwards, of being fired from Apple, of facing death. He told the graduates, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, living with the results of other people's thinking. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become." And finally, he ended with 4 words that became immortal: "Stay hungry, stay foolish." That wasn't just advice, it was the philosophy of his life. The family man few saw. Though much of his public image was shaped by Apple, Jobs' private life was more complex. His marriage to Laurene Powell in 1991 gave him stability. She was calm where he was restless, grounded where he was volatile. Together they raised 3 children, Reed, Erin, and Eve. Jobs, who once denied his first daughter Lisa, worked to be more present in his later years. But it wasn't easy. His children described him as loving but often distant. Work consumed him. Perfection consumed him. He struggled to separate fatherhood from his obsession with design and innovation. Yet, in his final days, Jobs told them, "I wanted my kids to know me. I wasn't always there, but I wanted them to understand why." Facing mortality. Perhaps the most profound part of Jobs' story was not his inventions, but his confrontation with death. Despite wealth, power, and fame, he could not escape cancer. His body grew frail, but his mind remained fierce. He spoke often about mortality, about the fragility of time. In one conversation he said, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. Jobs' death forced the world to face a sobering truth. Even the greatest visionaries are mortal. But what they leave behind, ideas, innovations, inspiration, outlives them. What Steve Jobs left us. Steve Jobs did not just give us gadgets. He gave us a philosophy. He proved that design matters. That technology is not just about circuits and code, but about human experience. He proved that rebellion can build empires, that failure can spark rebirth, that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And above all, he proved that one person driven by obsession and vision can truly dent the universe. Think of this. Every time you swipe a screen, listen to music on your phone, stream a movie, or connect with someone halfway across the world, there's a piece of Jobs in that moment. His fingerprints are invisible but eternal. The goosebump ending. Steve Jobs' life was a paradox. An abandoned child who built a global family of users, a ruthless boss who created products people loved, a man obsessed with the future yet forever haunted by his past. He once said, "We are all going to die, but until then, we have a chance to leave our mark." And he left his mark, not in stone, not in monuments, but in the way billions of people live, work, and dream. The boy who was unwanted at birth became the man the world could not forget. So the next time you pick up your phone, the next time you hear a song play seamlessly from your pocket, the next time you look at a piece of technology that feels almost alive, remember, it was born from the stubborn vision of a man who refused to settle. That is the legacy of Steve Jobs, not just the story of Apple, not just the story of computers, but the story of a human being who taught us, above all else, to stay hungry, to stay foolish, and to never stop believing that the crazy ones really can change the world.